Chapter 29, entitled Chordates, the Vertebrates, is our last chapter in which we will investigate individual groups of living things. Now, in this chapter, as it was in the last chapter with the invertebrates, we will divide the chapter into sections, and this lecture will cover sections 29.1 to 29.3, or general explanation about the chordates, the fish, as well as the amphibians. So let's take a look at some of the basic characteristics of all chordates. So in order to be considered a chordate, or in phylum Chordata, you must possess at least all of these four characteristics at some point during embryonic development. Now, some of these items will not be maintained into adulthood. So the first one we'll look at is the notochord, which is shown here in gray. In this lancelet, it's a flexible rod-shaped structure. It runs along underneath the dorsal nerve cord. So the dorsal nerve cord is on top. And for vertebrates, the notochord will go away in adulthood and develop into the vertebrae and the cranium, which will contain the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the dorsal hollow nerve cord that I mentioned and is shown here in yellow, in vertebrates, this will develop into the spinal cord. So this is nervous tissue, while the notochord will develop into either cartilaginous or bone structure that protects the nervous tissue. The third thing is the pharyngeal gill slits, shown here in this peach color. And this invertebrate fish will develop into the gill supports, or the organ that allows for the animal to take oxygen for respiration out of the water. Now, this is not true in tetrapods, or those vertebrates with four limbs. In those animals, the pharyngeal slits will develop into parts of the jaw, the ears, and the tonsils. Additionally, part of the pharyngeal slits develops into a structure called the endostyle, and in adults, in vertebrates, this will develop into the thyroid gland, which helps to regulate growth and metabolism usage. The last fourth characteristic is the postanal tail. So in this lancelet, it is the structure which is after the anus, or the end of the digestive system. In some vertebrates, this structure will be maintained and the animal will continue to have a tail. In other animals, the tail does not develop. Now, chordates, remember, are deuterostomes, meaning that they, in embryonic development, the digestive system develops the anus first and the mouth second. They are coelomates, true coelomates, meaning that they will have a true body cavity embedded in the mesoderm of the developing embryo, and this will create a space for internal organs that will cushion them. Keep in mind that the echinoderms that we talked about last chapter are also deuterostomes. Phylum Chordata has two main subgroups. There are a couple instances of invertebrate chordates, which might sound a little strange because we tend to think that all chordates have vertebra or a bony covering over what becomes their spinal cord. But there are some instances of invertebrate chordates where that notochord persists and does not develop into bony structures. So these include the tunicates and the lancelets that we'll talk about in a little bit. So those are invertebrate chordates. But again, the majority of members in phylum Chordata are in fact vertebrates. They fall into the subphylum Vertebrata, and that's what we will focus on in this chapter. So let's take a quick look at those tunicates and the lancelets, you don't need to know these subphylum names. These are the tunicates. They are water organisms. We find them on the ocean floor. They are marine. This is the embryonic form, and in the embryonic form you see that there are all 4 structures: notochord, the dorsal hollow nerve cord, the postanal tail, and the pharyngeal slits. Although once they develop into adults, they lose all 3 of those and just maintain the pharyngeal slits. These animals are filter feeders in the bottom of the ocean. They have a 1-chambered heart, and they are hermaphrodites, meaning that they contain both sexual species within one animal. We move on to the lancelets. Again, don't need to know the subphylum name. These are animals which again have all 4 structures: notochord, dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal slits, and the postanal tail. And they do maintain all 4 of these into the adult form. They are also marine animals. They live their life mostly buried in the sand. So you see them in the sand with only the head exposed, in which they filter feed their for plankton and other small invertebrates. They do have 2 sexes, 2 separate sexes for male and female organisms. All right, so let's move on to the subphylum Vertebrata. So these are the organisms that do develop both a cranium. So this is a bony cap over a brain structure, as well as a vertebral column, in which there is, when the vertebrae stack up on themselves, so this is one vertebra, another one, they stack up, there's a hollow column in which the spinal column or the nervous tissue, shown in yellow, can travel through from the brain and out to the body. So all vertebrates have a cranium of sorts and a vertebral column. So our first class, and I do need you to know the names of these classes, our first classes of vertebrates include the fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And the class names that I would like you to know are in parentheses. So we can subdivide our fish into the jawless fish, or the agnatha, the jawed fish, the fishes that have jaws, and that includes a cartilaginous group, chondrocythes, and the bony fish, ostracythes, and within ostracythes we have ray-finned and lobe-finned. Then we move into the amphibians, class Amphibia, reptiles, class Reptilia, birds, class Aves, and the mammals, class Mammalia. So many of the class names are easy to remember because they follow right from their common names. Remember, with all of our vertebrates, we can look at them and explain them directionally by they have an anterior end where the head is, a posterior end for the tail, dorsal represents the back, ventral represents the belly. So let's look at our first group of fish, the jawless fish. So they lack jaws. They also lack fins. They are a class Agnatha, and they have a cartilaginous skeleton. So no bones also in their skeleton, also no bones in their scales. They're rather eel-like, although eels are technically bony fish. So eels do not fall into this group, but they kind of look like eels. There's 2 main groups, the hagfish, which are shown in this upper picture here. They are marine organisms and they're scavengers. So these are individual hagfish. So they look for dead things and consume them, versus the lampreys, which are shown here. Remember, no jaws. So this is the mouth with lots of claspy teeth. These are freshwater species that sometimes spend some time in their life cycle in the marine water, but they're mostly freshwater. They are ectoparasites, meaning that they will clasp onto a living fish or other water mammal, and they will suck blood from that living organism. We then move on to the jawed fish within this first category of fish. So within jawed fish, we have two classes: chondrocythes, which are the cartilaginous fish, the sharks and the rays, as well as ostracythes, the bony fish, of which we have ray-finned and lobe-finned, and we'll talk more about those in a bit. But for all of these jawed fish, it looks like the evolution of jaws, the ability to have jaws, allowed these vertebrates to better utilize their food sources as opposed to the jawless fish, because this having jaws allowed for grasping and tearing of food sources. Jawed fish have they must have two pair of fins, pectoral and pelvic, and they may have additional fins. So the pectoral, think of pectoral as shoulder region. So here's one pectoral fin, the other would be on the other side, as well as pelvic, which is more like hips. So here are the pelvic fins. So there's paired pectoral and pelvic fins. In this particular fish, we see there's also an anal fin, a caudal fin, and a dorsal, or maybe even two dorsal fins. Now, these fish have a two-chambered heart, which is drawn out here. So there's a single atrium chamber and a single ventricle chamber. Atrium chambers are receiving chambers. They receive blood, so you see blood coming in with these arrows. And the ventricles are the pumping chambers. So in these fish species, you have oxygen poor blood returning from the body, because they all have a closed circulatory system with blood vessels, into the atrium, and then it gets pumped out to the gills. So it's all oxygen poor blood, and then it goes out to the gills, and then from the gills it picks up oxygen and goes out to the rest of the body. So now we'll take a look at these two groups, chondrocythes and ostracythes. First, looking at the chondrocythes, they include the sharks, the skates, and the rays. So the sharks are the predominant predators of the ocean. They have a skeleton made of cartilage, not bones. And the evolution of teeth, which evolved from modified scales. So the teeth are actually modified scale structures. And then here we have a ray. But continuing on with chondrocythes, the sharks have a keen sense of smell. They're able to detect electromagnetic fields, and that allows them to better hunt their prey. They must swim continuously to stay in the water column. And that's because they lack a swim bladder. A lot of folks think it's because they have to keep water going over their gills, but it's because if they don't have if they don't swim continuously, they're going to sink. They have what's called the lateral line, which is shown in red. This lateral line allows them its sensory cells, which allows them to detect movement and vibrations in the water. So this is a very key evolutionary factor. Bony fish have this also, so we'll see this. This allows fish to shoal or swim together in a group. So let's move on to ostracythes, which are the bony fish. The bony fish have a skeleton made of bone instead of cartilage. They also have a bony covering called an operculum. It's not shown in this picture because we're not seeing the outside of the fish, but here we have the gill structure, and outside of that would be a bony covering or a flap called the operculum that helps protect the gills. This is not present in the chondrocythes. If I go back, you see open gill slits in the chondrocythes. So the ostracites have a covering for their gills. They also have a swim bladder, which is this beige structure internally. It's filled with air. And so when a fish comes up to the surface and gulps air, it's not to get the air to breathe. It's to get the air to fill their swim bladder so that they can let air in and out and they can go to whatever level in the water column they wish to be at. Their scales are also bony structures. We then have the ray-finned fish. So within Ostracites, two groups, the ray-finned and the lobe-finned fish. Most of our current day modern fish are ray-finned, and that means they have thin bony structures within their fins to help expand their fins. You see it here in this dorsal fin, in the pectoral fin, and in the pelvic fins, as well as caudal and the anal fins. Now the lobe-finned fish, these have structures that actually have bones in them that are much more like fingers. So it's believed that these fish, and there's few examples of them in the modern category, but there are lots of fossil records, and the coelacanth is one fossil record which shows these bony fingers in the fins, which particularly the pectoral fins, which are believed, and the pelvic fins, which are believed to have evolved into limbs for migration to land. So here we have an example of a lobe-finned fish right here with structures that actually have little bony fingers. I'm sorry, this is the lobe-finned fish, right, and then it evolved into examples like this tikalik fossil, which is a transition animal between the lobe-finned fish and the current day amphibians. And so it had fish-like structures, but it also had 4 limbs, as well as a more flattened face representing the reptiles, the amphibians, excuse me. So as we move into our next group, which are the amphibians, class Amphibia, we see that amphibians have moved onto land. They are tetrapods, 4 legs or feet, and they include examples like the frogs, the salamanders, and the toads. Those are some of the most recognizable examples. They are terrestrial, meaning they live on land, but this class is still tied to water, must live near to water, no matter which group you fall into. Why? Because they have cutaneous respiration. This means, and it's shown here in this frog diagram, that they breathe across their skin. We see they have oxygen. They have oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide going out, which those arrows should be the other way around. And this is why their skin needs to stay moist for this gas exchange. Now, in addition, some amphibians also do have lungs. We see lungs here in the frog, as well as the fact that they can breathe across their mouth cavity. And some examples of amphibians may retain their gills as well. These animals begin their life, they have, amphibian means 2 lives, so they begin their lives as a tadpole, which is completely aquatic, and then they move into they metamorphosize into the adult form, which is able to live on land. They have a 3-chambered heart. So here we see the diagram of the 3-chambered heart with 2 atria, a right atrium and a left atrium, as well as a single ventricle. So we have blood returning to the heart from the frog's body or any amphibian's body, comes in, this is blue showing it's low in oxygen, comes into the ventricle. We also see that blood is coming into the other atrium, and we have a mixing. We have blood that comes out and goes to the lungs to pick up more oxygen, some of it, and some of it goes out to the body to deliver oxygen. So there's a mixing here, and that tends to make the blood less efficient in delivering oxygen. But because they are able to deliver oxygen via their skin, they don't need to have as efficient a heart. Now, regarding reproduction, the eggs are laid in water, hence they have external fertilization. Sperm are added to the eggs, external fertilization outside of the body, and the new amphibians develop externally as well without parental involvement. And this is true of the fish. They also have external fertilization and development. As far as amphibians, the salamanders, some have gills and some have lungs. They also have internal fertilization, which is different from the frogs and the toads, but still have external development. So we move on to our frogs and our toads. They have external fertilization and development. They have a body plan that is specialized for movement and jumping, longer legs, more muscles in these posterior limbs. They are the ones that will begin their lives as tadpoles. So they have a completely aqueous juvenile period, larval juvenile period, and then they metamorphosize into the adult form, which will live on land. So now we will stop, and then we will pick up this in the second part and discuss reptiles, birds, and mammals.